On the 9th of February 1964, the Beatles performed on The Ed Sullivan Show, and practically overnight, Beatlemania spread across the United States and around the world. To cash in on the craze, a flood of Beatles merchandise entered the marketplace. Among these were an abundance of novelty songs about the Beatles. Some estimates say there were close to 200 singles released in the 1960s alone, but one in particular stands out. This right here, Ringo for President by the Young World Singers. And what's crazy to me is that this was in response to an actual political campaign where young people were advocating for Ringo Starr to run as a US presidential nominee. In today's video, we're going to dive into the history of the movement, how this single came about, and why people wanted Ringo for president. In order to talk about how this single came about, it's important to understand the political climate in the United States at this time. Now, 1964 was an election year, meaning in November, citizens were going to vote for the next US president. And there was a lot of presidential activity with nominations, there's a lot of press coverage, but also there was a large group of Americans that were still grieving the assassination of President Kennedy the year before. He was the second youngest US president, and his charisma was showcased during the first televised presidential debates in US history. His ability to capitalize on the television medium and his youthful appearance got more young people interested in the election than in previous ones. And so there were a lot of young people who were going to vote for the first time in 1964, so they were energized. On top of this, the Beatles' popularity exploded in the United States after their performance on The Ed Sullivan Show earlier in the year, which was then followed by a slew of hit singles, including the band holding the top 5 spots on the Billboard chart on April 4th. Now, the Beatles represented youth culture, and many young people of voting age didn't believe that the candidates for the 1964 election represented them, especially after the youthful energy of President Kennedy. So it makes sense that there was a push to get someone who they were fans of, like Ringo, elected president. But why did they pick Ringo? Why not one of the other members? I mean, even back then, the general consensus was that he was the most goofy looking of all the Beatles. But I think that's precisely why he was chosen. He seemed like the most regular member of the group, and he exuded a nearly constant happy-go-lucky attitude. He just generally seemed to be stoked to be drumming for the band. And all of this was showcased in the film A Hard Day's Night, which was released on Ringo's 24th birthday. I think Ringo was perceived as one of them, just a normal, down-to-earth guy who just happened to be in the biggest band in the world. Now, near as I can tell, the Ringo for President movement started somewhere on a college campus in Ohio. It got popular enough that a radio station in Cleveland picked up on the idea and urged listeners to stage public rallies and petitions in support of Ringo for president. Eventually, this movement spread around the country and more young people joined in on the fun, with some staging actual pickets. In July of '64, roughly a week after the release of A Hard Day's Night, the Republicans held their national convention just outside San Francisco at the Cow Palace. Incidentally, the Beatles would play the very same venue a month later during their 1964 tour of North America. Now, outside the convention, a small crowd was picketing, urging people to vote for Ringo. There were also reports of about 8 Ringo for President teenagers outside the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco, where many of the Republican leaders were staying. At this point, the movement started getting national attention, and a producer by the name of Bud Granoff had the idea for a song to capitalize on the phenomenon. He hired the songwriting team of Bob Hillard and Mort Garson to come up with the song. Now, what's interesting is that both of these gentlemen have quite a history in the music industry. Bob was a lyricist who worked with many composers, including Burt Bacharach, and he wrote the lyrics for several well-known songs, including the theme for Walt Disney's Alice in Wonderland and Sinatra's In the Wee Small Hours of the Morning. Mort Garson started his career as a multi-talented session musician, eventually graduating to an arranger and composer. Together, Bob and Mort wrote the song Our Day Will Come, which became a huge hit for Ruby and the Romantics. Bob and Mort wrote the song as well as the B-side, A Boy Like That. Bud produced the single and got the Young World Singers to record vocals for both tracks, but there's literally no information about who they were or what else they sang. More than likely, they were a group of session singers hired for the recording. Decca Records released the single in August of 1964, and it became somewhat of a hit, bubbling under the top 100, peaking at number 132, but Funny enough, it was actually a #1 hit single in Malaysia of all places, and the single also spurred a cover version by Australian singer Rolf Harris, who just happened to rub elbows with the Beatles in December of 1963 when they sang backup vocals on his performance of Tie Me Kangaroo Down Sport for a BBC radio show. As the Beatles continued their 1964 tour across America, the movement for President Ringo followed them. For their August 20th appearance in Las Vegas, the audience at the Sahara Hotel Convention Center started chanting Ringo for President while waiting for the band to play. Chants also happened at their Denver show, and fans lined the streets of New York City picketing in support of Ringo when the band came to town for their September 20th show. Though the Beatles themselves found the campaign amusing, their manager Brian Epstein urged them not to comment on it as he felt the Beatles should not get into politics, at least not publicly. He even turned down an opportunity for the Beatles to take a photo laying a wreath on the grave of President Kennedy alongside President Johnson. I did find one interview from '64 where the Beatles were asked about it directly, and their answers were quite amusing. In the end, the movement was never going to succeed. I mean, the young people involved really weren't seriously trying to get Ringo for president. They knew he could never actually be nominated because he wasn't born in the United States. It was just something fun to do, and it was a way to create some levity amidst the grief and uncertainty that still lingered after the assassination of President Kennedy the year before. It also happened that a lot of the presidential campaign activity was occurring in the same cities that the Beatles were performing in, so it was like this perfect confluence of events, and in a weird way, it just sort of made sense. The Ringo for President movement was a way for young people to express both their love of the band and their displeasure with the feeling that the candidates from both parties didn't represent their values or opinions. As far as the single, it didn't have an impact on those who made it. I don't know what happened to the young world singers. It seems like this was their only release, although Discogs credits them as releasing more music in the 70s as a Christian singing group going by the name of Young World, but I can't find any proof of this being the same group. It could be a case of a different group using the same name, or they could be related. It's hard to know for sure. Producer Bud Granoff continued to manage the career of his wife, singer Kitty Kallen, and eventually moved into television production working with his friend Chuck Barris, the creator of The Gong Show, The Dating Game, and The Newlywed Game. Bud passed away in 1996 at the age of 77. As far as I can tell, Bob and Mort didn't write another song together after Ringo for President, and it seems Bob didn't have another hit before he passed away in 1971 after suffering a heart attack. He was eventually inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame in 1983. Mort had the most success out of everyone involved. In the later half of the 60s, he became a pioneer in the Moog synthesizer space, really showing what electronic music could be, releasing several albums featuring the instrument. Many of these have increased in popularity over the years, including the cult favorite Plantasia album, a record he wrote specifically for plants to listen to. Also, during the Apollo 11 mission in 1969, his music was used during the television broadcast. He continued to compose and arrange music until his death in 2008. As for Ringo, I couldn't find an interview or anyone asking about what he thought of the song itself. I'm not really sure if he even knows it exists, but you can tell he has fondness for the movement, as he will often reference it over the years, including a few promotional items for his 15th studio album, Liverpool 8, and his 2020 election tweet. Alright everybody, that will do it for today. Let me know what you think of the Ringo for President movement. Did you know about it before this video, or were you like me and you just discovered this? As for the song itself, you know, I don't know. It's a novelty song. I don't know what else to say about it. It's not bad, but it's not great. It was a moment in time, if you know what I mean. But yeah, check it out. Let me know what you think with a comment down below. Also, I partnered with a new merch supplier, and I had fun coming up with these Ringo for President t-shirts. I sort of took that early Liverpool 8 design, kind of made it my own. So yeah, there's a whole slew of other merchandise, so be sure to check it out on my newly revamped website. Until then, I want to thank you all so much for watching, but I especially want to thank my members over on Patreon. They really help to keep this show going. I'm your Vinyl Geek, and I'll catch you on the flip side.